and thank you everybody for joining us today. So I'm Alan Davis. I am the manager of admissions and recruitment for the School of Medicine at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I've been a member of AACRAO for a little over a year. I had initially submitted Minor Feelings as a book to kind of cover in the book club. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of do a brief synopsis of the book and some of the themes that we'll be going over. But I'm excited to be here and talk to you all today.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Sue, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm part of the organization called Asian American Advocacy Fund. And actually, it's my first time knowing and joining AACRAO. And actually, in fact, Michelle, who's supposed to be here today, is my good friend from New York, and she kind of invited me to this book club event. She just wanted for me to share my perspective as a Asian American and like a community organizer at the AAPI organizations. So yeah, I'm very excited for today's event. Very nice meeting y'all.
And unfortunately, Michelle will not be joining us today, but she played a huge role in kind of our pre-conversations as we were talking about what we wanted to cover in discussing minor feelings and some of the themes that we wanted to explore. So basic kind of premise is we will kind of talk about why we were really interested in talking about this book, go through some of the themes that really stood out to us that we thought would lead to a really rich discussion. We'll go into some breakout rooms after Sue and I cover some of those themes, and then we'll come back together as a group to kind of launch into sort of the what next steps and really thinking about how to take this, the themes of the book into application. So when I had submitted the book, there were a couple of different reasons why I was just so interested in talking to people in AACRAO about minor feelings. So kind of the biggest element of why minor feelings was in 2020, the way I got impacted with, the things that were going around with COVID and kind of moving to working virtually was I picked up reading and audiobooks a lot more than in previous years. And to tell the truth, like Minor Feelings was the book that had the largest impact on me. It was, to me, the best book that I encountered in 2020. I thought it was very rich and very powerful. The gift of a poet to be able to write the way that she does, but exploring the type of modular essay. I'm a really big fan of the essay format. And so the way that she's exploring particular ideas, the content was rich, but I also just loved the medium that she was using and exploring. So that was one element. The other element that made me kind of really want to talk about it, particularly in our setting, is thinking about, and she gets to this a little bit in the book, is the role education has played in Asian American identity history. So in talking about the history of education and immigration policy, we'll get into a little bit about that myth of the model minority. But in my particular circumstances at the School of Medicine, we have a 6-year BA/MD program. So we have students who are applying right out of high school. And the demographics for our school is that almost 50% of our medical school, our students are Asian American. But we talk about kind of, while 50% of our students are Asian American, there is that distinction between Asian Americans that are very well represented in the profession of medicine, and then other Asian American who come from ethnicities that aren't well represented in medicine. And so right now, I think there's a lot of the conversations of Asian American identity and what that means in an admission process with the Supreme Court cases that are happening, and those tension between being a minoritized community, but not always identified as a minoritized community within admissions and educational settings. And so I thought, in addition to kind of just the raw content the author is exploring, it has direct implications for what we do, either in admissions offices or registrar offices. Sue, was there any other things that you kind of wanted to add of like why this book, why now?
So like for me, I am part of like AAPI organizations, and with this organization, we're working like mostly with the Asian American communities in Georgia. And for last year and this year, the election is a big thing, like throughout the nation, and especially in the state of Georgia too. And like Asian American communities are fast growing community in throughout the US and in Georgia as well. And like the like Asian voter, like American voter participation was a really huge in Georgia too. And there, since then, there are more like a movement of like Asian American like reckoning, and there more awareness of Asian American communities and their experiences. And also in the past March, there is an Atlanta shooting incident that also sort of like highlight the experience of Asian American and Asian American women in Georgia, and how their experience living in the U.S. and this socioeconomic status and all this like legal status have been created, have affected and how our like current policies and how our like current understanding and uh, within, I guess, like constructed under white supremacy has like directly affect our community members. So I think this book is a great way to like start looking and comparing like how our like current experience living in this country and as Asian Americans. And yeah, and I've been having this book for a while, but didn't really have a chance to read it until recently, until like Michelle recommended to this like a book event. So yeah, I really there's a many part that I can like personally that resonated with, and yeah, and I really like this book because it sounds very current, because I've been like studying Asian American studies in back in college and back in my academia, but many of those research are sounds very much of like outdated, and they are still talking about those like traditional like parents versus Americanized like immigrant kids, and having those like a traditional or idea is something like really um, not they're more focusing on this like a cultural break um, within the Asian American communities, rather like focusing on this like a big picture and the current issues of racism and their solidarity with other racial communities and more. But this book touches upon more of the subject, so it's a real really interesting to read.
Thank you. And I think some of the big things that she's giving us with that idea of minor feelings, in defining it as the sediments of everyday racial experience and the irritant of having it dismissed, ignored, or questioned, sort of leads into the first of three themes we wanted to talk about. And Michelle is going to cover this a little bit more, so Sue and I will jump in and kind of talking about the way that identity and otherness is explored in the book, but really that element that she's talking about with minor feelings, there's this level of tension between visibility and invisibility. So times in which, and I think about this particularly in her chapter on Richard Pryor and her exploring doing stand-up, that there is a component of the force or the tension on trying to be invisible. Like that there, pull a quote that I really liked. She said on page 8, Asians lack presence. Asians take up apologetic space. We don't even have enough presence to be considered real minorities. We're not racial enough to be token. We're so post-racial, we're silicone. And so she deals with this kind of tension of the forces that are there to kind of push Asian American identity into assimilation, into disappearing, into not being present, to kind of become invisible in the background, while there are all these forces that also make it impossible to be invisible, that no matter how many centuries go by, even as there are ethnic groups who have been here as immigrated quite a while ago, never being allowed to fully integrate and be seen as American. And so while there is this tension to make sure you disappear, there's also the things that make it impossible to be invisible as things are forcing. And so like one of the things I really liked about the Richard Pryor chapter is her taking control and like doing live performance requires an audience to see you. It requires you to interact with them. And so pushing against that element that asks her to dissolve or be invisible, and particularly in her work as a poet, particularly as she talks about what's expected of Asian American writers, poets or essayists, is that you provide something that any reader can step into, and that Asian American identity is vacuumed out, so anybody can sort of step in, but different performance or art practices that disrupt that. And so when she's talking about those readings that she's doing or doing stand-up, I think that's a really strong element of ways that she's trying to challenge that. And to me, I mentioned in this little kind of promo videos that we did, one moment I keep returning to in the book is when she goes to give a reading. I think it was in Washington, but she's out basically giving a reading at an invited event, and she reads some of the essays that are going to be in this collection. And a woman comes up to her and says she really appreciated what was said, but she wished that she had read some poems. And then the woman who's interacting with her, who's white, says, we just need poems to heal. And her response is, I don't want to heal. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do right now. And the woman responded, I respect that. And so she's dealing with a couple of times where she talks about, I want to comfort the afflicted. I want to be able to have art that helps those that feel caught in this tension between the visible and the invisible. But I also want to afflict the comfortable. And so she is thinking about how that art can be pushing you outside of a comfort zone, or to make you kind of interact with something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Again, it's sort of the work that she kind of highlights with Richard Pryor. So is there any other kind of components in this that stood out to you wanted to mention?
Like for me, like being invisible Asian American is something we are like just like Kathy Parko sort of like mentioned in the book, is one that we are comfortable with. But at the same time, throughout this book, I see like how like Kathy Parko is trying hard to just challenge her invisibility by, going against something that is expected as Asian Americans. And this like the conversation between invisible and visibility, like hypervisibility and invisibility of Asian American, is always the topic around our racialized experiences here too. So I think like we can also connect this to the other theme that we're gonna discuss at the later, but this notion, the notion of and the myth of model minority is also the part that this myth like keeping us like invisible to the conversation of race in the United States discourse of race, but at the same time, like being a model minority is like it's like sorry, let me just read it again. So making us as visible as modern minority is a way to making us invisible in the U.S. discourse of the race. So and as a part of like a organizing organizer, like community organizer, like our like motto as an organization is like to make our voice heard, so make ourselves visible, to the community and to the society. So many in this book, Kathy Parko used her invisibility to visible throughout her work of art and her expression in art. But I was just thinking, what will be a best way for us, like a community organizer, and especially like us as working in a policy making organization, is way to make our invisible to visible. So that was the part that I was thinking deeply while reading this, appear in the theme of identity and otherness. And yeah, and also the language and writing is another theme that came up this book. And for me, this theme around language is the part that I like personally resonated the most. And I see throughout the book, like Kathy Park-Hong experience her evolving identity as a writer through her relationship to English. So by growing up, how I understood it is like Kathy Park-Hong had this minor feeling, her embarrassment and the shame of her parents' bad English. So she tried to correct and perfect their English grammar to hide or disguise the parents' immigrant identities. So that's what she really tried. But at the end, she realized that the language is not the problem for the discrimination they experience as immigrant families, but it's definitely a one of the factor. But and also Kathy Park-Hong, even though there's a moment of denial of her a bad English or bad English, but later on she kind of utilize it as the power of her artistic expression. So I see how this minor feeling eventually transformed into a power of expression, and yeah, that was really interesting to see. But it also not only for the Kathy Parko, but later on there's a story of Teresa Hagyong-Cha and her power in expression using using an expression not just directly translated in English, but using her this melancholies and this sense that she could only express in Korean. So language and language in the expression of writing is the power, was one of the themes that came up throughout this book. And interestingly, when I was reading this part, the bad English, and there's a part that Kathy Park-Hong said the bad English, her heritage. Recently, I got a question about what will be my heritage, but I couldn't think of anything. But then I also too came up with probably the language, because as an immigrant kid, I guess that my first discrimination experience is always come up with the language, because I came to the United States when I was in middle school, and yes, there's probably my race and my skin color or my Asianness may stood up, but as I started speaking, and when the classmates hear that I didn't speak English well, and there's this discrimination start to came into me. So that was a big stress to me too. Having this not perfectly speaking in English is always a stress, and that's where I sort of grew up my minor feeling as a shame and embarrassment that I can't fit in this society, and I can't express myself fully due to my lacking in mastery in English and all. But later on, just like a Kathy Park-Hong experiences, I sort of experience those like evolving identity or like a transformation that minor feelings into power. So for me, like speaking both languages and expressing, I don't know, sometimes I like mix up those two languages to create my own way to express feelings and it is able to explain what this feelings is about is sort of like a empowerment for me, just like Kathy Parkon is writing through her poems. Um, so yeah, like and I don't know how to like end it, but that's the like another theme that we came up to cross in this book.
Yeah, one of the things I just wanted to kind of add with that is like I really love what she's doing in that bad English chapter, because part of it is sort of laying out, you're seeing what her methodology is when she's written poems and when she's used bad English strategically in the poetry she's writing. But it's also getting very meta because she starts to hit on, so why is a poet writing a number of essays? Like, why is she exploring this modular essay format? And she works through kind of theory in a number of different ways, whether it's from the Black arts movement and what Amiri Baraka said about jazz, or what she does with the idea of how queer has moved from a notion of a noun to a verb and like an active thing that can be done. And so she's writing from her position to English is not the same as her parents or her grandparent who immigrated and having to learn English in that way. And she can never really kind of step into their experience because automatically her relationship to English is different. But she can write near it and kind of approximate it. And in the queering aspect, how is it that she can be subversive with it, recognizing that the reason everybody at this point is expected to learn English is that it plays a colonizing force throughout the world, and that, right to what Sue said, like you start to feel bad if you haven't learned it, and not that you are doing the extra work of learning a secondary or tertiary language, but that any misstep is an onus on you that you haven't done enough work. And so that it always kind of victimizes the person who's trying to put it into use, and her flipping that on its head. How can you be subversive to take those instances where English doesn't work the way it's supposed to, but is a chance for the subaltern to kind of take back over, to take control, and to use it sort of in that queering way that a lot of different art movements has sort of explored. And so I like thinking about like the very act of her using essays is her attempt to do those things, to disrupt the expectation that's embedded in what you think an essay should be or what it should be about. For the final theme that we were really interested in, and Sue hit on this a little bit, is that embedded in minor feelings is this cognitive dissonance, that there's all these narratives that Asian Americans could be surrounded by, like, and everybody in the US, that there's a history of progress. Like we don't have the immigration laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We don't have the same type of English test standard that is embedded in some of the immigration laws. And so there is this capacity for there to be like, things aren't as bad as they used to be. And even as people are doing a little bit better of a job of trying to learn about how whiteness itself is a race, it's a racial identity, it has its own history, there's also been connected to that this presumption that things are just always getting better for Asian Americans. And I love where she tackles with that idea of like Asians are going to be white next. So if you think of this history of white and whiteness in the US, it has been fairly malleable. There's this expectation of, oh, well, Asians are going to be white next. And she disrupts that immediately. It's like, Asians have been here for a while. When is it going to happen? Like, when is this magical time of like amazing progress going to happen that assimilation has occurred in that way? And what that sets up is also one, it dismisses any of the moments where there is that irritant, where there is that sedimented feeling of having a racialized experience, and kind of pushes it away. It also, as she talks about, it sets up this savior complex in the history of the US in relation to Asian countries, that the places over there, it's a good thing you escaped from there, or your parents escaped from there, that anything that occurs outside the US, particularly in Asian countries, that is not as good. And so like the very act of coming to the US is itself a moment of salvation. And one of the things that really resonated with me or struck with me, as I was seeing a lot of echoes in what she talks about with minor feelings in relation to another book that's published by some scholars. They have a book that is called Racial Dissonance and Racial Melancholia. And they specifically are looking at Asian American students, and it's a psychoanalyst and a literary or English professor. And they were working with students. The research is a little bit older because the students were millennials. So now it's Gen Z. There's a bit of a remove, but I anticipate there's still some similar trends. What they talk about is that the Asian American students that they were working with would have racialized experiences. They would have things that would happen to them because they were Asian American. And yet those students did not have the language or tools to talk about it and to process it as a racialized experience. Because all of the things that they were kind of trained to do was within this sort of myth of the model minority, where your sense of race or your ability to talk about things in terms of race are pushed away or pushed aside and not encouraged. And so what they talk about is that there's a difference. This is a Freud theory, but in mourning, you lose something and you have the process where you can grieve. So you're like, I no longer have this thing, it's gone, and I miss it, but I'm confronting the loss and working through it. But in melancholia, you're in a constant state of loss without ever being able to process. And they talk about that without having the access or the encouragement to think about their experiences in terms of being racialized, that the Asian American students they were working with were kind of always in the struggle to be able to kind of identify what was happening with them. And I thought that struck so hard with what she's talking about with minor feelings, is that you know this thing is happening, but maybe not having the language to talk about that reality while you're continually being fed this sort of idea that progress has occurred. And so to me, that I think a lot about, as we're working with students who are trying to apply and coming into college settings, or when they're with us and they're navigating their own particular programs, what are the things that we can do to be mindful of those experiences that they're having, or ways to talk with them when they are trying to deal with this sort of cognitive dissonance. So
Yes, for me, when I read the part about this cognitive dissonance and just hearing about what this is, when we as an immigrants are first moving to the United States, the one we hear about this American dream or American opportunity, but we never are mentioned about this racism that we're gonna experience as we are entering looking for this American dream. So that's also this clash between the real lived racial experiences versus American optimism that I can also I can resonate. And another thing that just came across to me while reading this book is that because of this a minor feeling that has been grown up due to those a cognitive dissonance and other type of discrimination and the racism. Kathy Parcon, she mentioned that that sort of like the real problem with this like having minor feeling is that it tends to like separate oneself from the race instead of being supportive each other. So by like hearing that, I can for I was Korean when I was in Korea, but now I became like by entering the US, I became Asian American. So for me in that situation, I feel like those like Asian Americans share like the same experience that we will understand each other. But in fact, the reality, the racialized reality is that because of these minor feelings that's embedded in each of us, it actually like separates us from each other, and not only like from one Asian like race ethnicity to another Asian ethnicity, but within the Korean race itself, it plays that one too. Because I grew up as a like a immigrant kid, and I identified myself as a 1.5 generation. That really separates the experience from the first generation Korean American and the second generation Korean American who was born here. So when I like first came to the US, the biggest like I would say like a racial or like a generational tension I experienced, and that came out really stressful, was not me between other racial groups, but me between like same racial like Korean American groups, but with like a different generations. So I think like the how like Kathy Parker wanted to point out this like cognitive dissonance and this like this minor feelings that separates us, that can apply to those like a racial discourse, but that can also be applied to the generational discourse within the race.
So Sue and I have been chatting a bit, but we want everybody to get involved too. So we're actually going to go ahead and move into, this quote from, we're going to move into breakout rooms, but we also had this quote of the privilege of assimilation is that you are left alone, but assimilation must not be mistaken for power, because once you have acquired power, you are exposed, and your model minority qualifications that helped you in the past can be used against you. Since you are no longer invisible. And this struck us quite a bit because I think it encapsulates all three of the themes that we're sort of thinking about, whether that's the element of power that was in our kind of conversation about bad English, whether that's the what makes a person visible or invisible, and then this tension of moving through the different identities and structures that are present. And so thinking about whether that's with present in the work that you do, your own identity, or maybe the students that you're engaging with, we thought it would be great to kind of jump off from the main themes that we've been discussing into breakout rooms where we could get a little bit more into kind of nitty gritty, where you can sort of express your ideas of what you had with the book. And so we do have some prompts of questions we'd like to discuss as we go into the breakout rooms. And it's kind of first main two questions is, how do you utilize your passion to affect change? So when you're thinking about how this book may have inspired you and maybe given you thoughts about what you would like to do to change or challenge certain things, how do you use your passion to do that? And how does this make you think or rethink your institutional practices? What are the different things that are occurring in your offices or within your institution that could be illuminated by the book we've been reading and discussing this month?
All right, great. So I'm going to split everybody out into rooms now. We'll have the rooms open for 10 minutes. I'll send out prompts, as we get closer to that ending threshold. And then you'll have 60 or actually 30 seconds in a countdown once we reach that 10-minute mark to kind of wrap everything up before your kickback here. So have fun, everybody. All right, I had to move. So it ends up being about 3 or 4 per room that we have.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, some people are dropping off though. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, we lost right at that breakout room part. We lost like 3 people. So
Oh man.
c'est la vie, whatever. But we'll still have it open for 10 minutes. So I'll give a reminder. I don't know, as a co-host, do you have the ability to broadcast a message to all?
I don't see it.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if you can see that breakout room area.
Oh, I can. And I can broadcast a message.
Yeah, so if you want to broadcast something at 5 minutes and then with 1 minute, that's probably fine.
Okay, sounds good.
And 1 second, I'll be right back.